Afternoon all. Let's have a look at an early encounter between Magnus Carlsen and Nigel Short in the Essent tournament played in Hoogeveen, Netherlands in 2004. Magnus Carlsen was 13 years old, I believe, at the time of this game, with a rating of 2581. Nigel Short was 2687, so nearly Super GM status, approaching that 2700 mark, which Nigel has been over quite a few times. So Magnus kicked off with D4. In this tournament, by the way, it was a 4-player all play all, and the two foreign guests to the Netherlands tournament were Magnussen and Nigel. Stelwagen and Ivan Sokolov were the local grandmasters being tested by the foreign visitors. But okay, so Nigel Short playing black here, plays knight f6. After c4 e6, as though there's going to be an IMSO engine, possibly if knight c3 bishop b4, but we see knight f3 instead, and Nigel plays d5, which he's had actually very good success with. The Queen's Gambit declines, solid but aggressive approach being used often by Nigel Short in this. After knight c3, bishop e7, bishop f4, and now Nigel castles. And after e3 we see the Tarrasch strategy, c5 here in this position, kind of delayed Tarrasch mechanism, inviting an isolated queen's pawn situation, but to guarantee black piece activity like this bishop being liberated and the rooks having a good time later. Magnus takes with d takes c5 actually, and after bishop takes c5, c takes d5. It's not an isolated queen's pawn immediately. Nigel plays knight takes d5, so hitting f4 and c3, and now we get the isolated queen's pawn after knight takes e takes d5. So is Magnus going to be able to play on this d5 pawn, or is going to use a slightly different strategy? His first move is a3 actually, which gives the indication that maybe later b4 and maybe the c file and c5 are going to be useful for white. Knight c6 is played, which shows actually that unless there's going to be a blockade, maybe black is free actually to liberate with d4 quite quickly. This next move by Magnus has a little bit of bite to it, eyeing h7. It looks as though bishop takes h7 is actually threatened, with queen c2 check to follow and hitting the bishop on c5, which might explain Nigel's next move, or simply queen c2, of course, with a double attack. With the absence of the knight on f6, h7 is more sensitive than usual here. So bishop b6, getting the bishop out of the way, not a loose piece. But after castling, Magnus is not blockading that pawn, and it is actually pushed with d4. And here we see an interesting situation, really. Magnus actually chooses e4, so he's keeping this potentially dangerous d4 pawn here. It is kind of blocking in the bishop though across this diagonal, so at least f2 doesn't have to be concerned about being pinned here. But there's another concern in this position. This pin here is quite annoying now. An actual bishop e2 might run into later something like d3 if white's not careful. And also, what about the e5 square? At the moment, the only thing contesting the e5 square is this bishop. This pin being annoying is a cause of concern, and Magnus plays h3 in this particular position. And after bishop h5, he doesn't play bishop e2 to unpin, and this is a move which you may find a little surprising. It's g4. Magnus is voluntarily weakening his kingside, it seems, just to relieve the pin. Bishop g6, but on the other hand, will this bishop have a future? Could actually f6 be played? Bishop f7? Maybe this diagonal is fine. We see now knight d2, which has at least two ideas, that knight c4 might be useful, and also if the bishop moves, then the pawn is freed to play f4. which maybe implies either f5 or just controlling the e5 square. So we see black now marking out the e5 square with f6, and also maybe the bishop's useful on this diagonal. Rook c1 is played, and now king h8. The king doesn't really want to be on the sensitive diagonal. I guess the bishop f7 move was also possible. We'll check this out in the second pass if this prophylaxis move was needed. Knight c4, and the bishop is preserved with bishop c7, as well as challenging the protector of e5. Can black use the e5 square here? Well, actually, the ambitions to use the e5 square are challenged. Magnus takes on c7 and now plays f4. Okay, is there a vacuum though developing? Are these pawns actually safe enough here? Rook ae8, e4 has to be defended. Queen f3 is played. And now queen e7, putting again pressure on e4. And it's an interesting decision here. Should this rook, which looks quite comfortable on c1, be used, or should this rook be used? In fact, Magnus uses the c rook, which you might find a little surprising. I think we need to check out in the second pass the use of the other rook. Bishop f7. Okay. Is there a tactical liability being created here? Is b5 actually possible at some point as well as a forcing move to consider? Is there another idea behind bishop f7? Well, we're about to see. After knight d2, Nigel plays a very interesting move in this position, kind of positionally orientated. g5. Now, in principle, you might argue, isn't there some weaknesses created? Like, isn't this weak? f6, isn't g5 potentially weak? But the idea, the positional idea, is to grab hold of the e5 square. Okay, so if white played, for example, f5, then beautiful knight with knight e5, lovely blockader. Nimzovich would be proud. If fg again, it seems fg here, this could be a problem with e5. But the way Magnus plays this position is, of course, more accurate than that. He plays bishop b5. This is a really annoying counterpin, made actually possible, of course, by his knight retreat. Otherwise, this would be just not possible. So the annoying knight pin really stops black's plans in its track, with neither f5 or fg needed, and g takes can give white the option of bishop takes, leaving black with fragmented pawns. This is a very dangerous scenario, this fragmentation, with f6 as a clear target. So Nigel is not too keen, perhaps, to play g takes f4. His next move might not be the most accurate. We'll need to check in the second pass. This a6 is played here. And now it seems Magnus is keen to give up the light square bishop. What is he getting in return? He plays now f takes g5. Previously it would be positional murder, allowing a knight on e5, but here it seems safe enough. And in fact now there's a liability on c6 as well. So Magnus's next move exposes that liability. Queen f6 check. He doesn't mind the exchange of queens. We'll be on c6. That's really dangerous, that position. The bishop hasn't got an entry point on c4. This knight's holding up c4. So Nigel's not too keen at the moment to exchange off queens. He plays king g8. But, of course, there's a pawn hanging here. Does black have dynamism? Well, there's two pawns hanging. There's a choice. Queen takes here or here. Okay, the d4 pawn is chosen. Queen takes d4. Nigel plays c5. Now this invitation to exchange off queens again. If the queen flees, then queen takes g5, so g5 is a problem as well. So the queen's actually taken here, and black has a little bit of counterplay though, with rook b8. What can be done about this backward pawn on the open file? Okay, well, the counter-attack on g5 with knight f3, exchange of prisoners is an option, exchange b2 for g5. So something's gone clearly wrong, it seems, unless Nigel is banking on something else in the position, like this passed pawn. He's pawn down still, after rook takes b2, knight takes g5. Pawn down, but can white really use this majority? And this rook's on the 7th, and this bishop's potentially good, and this c-pawn's potentially dangerous. Can Magnus control this position? In fact, the bishop might be slightly better than the knight in certain circumstances. It's actually moved rather obscurely to the a2 square, just out of the way, keeping an eye on the whole diagonal, and maybe ready to sort of guide the pawn in for the docking on c1. Also inviting an exchange of rooks. Magnus takes up that invitation for the exchange of rooks. So the question is, does he dare also win a second pawn now and give this pawn even more chance, it seems, to accelerate to a queening square? Magnus does take on h7, 2 pawns up, but he needs to play precisely. He can't just surely move this pawn, he'll be in trouble. He plays actually knight g5, now c4, and this looks quite dangerous. You can imagine once the pawn gets to c2, there's rook b1. Could be very, very dangerous. The move here played is rook c1, stopping c3. Rook b3 now forks basically 2 pawns, getting at least pawn back if this knight moves. Hold on a sec. But how to defend a3? King f2. Nigel's not even keen to take on a3, and he certainly cannot take on c4. Well, here, if you're taking on c4, then of course check. Looks like it's winning the rook. So he's material down, 2 pawns down. What can black do? c3 still looks as though it's dangerous because he can have the option of taking the pawn. So what does Magnus do? Protect the pawn or try and make use of his own resources constructively? He actually plays in this position e5. Okay, and now Nigel is only 1 pawn down after taking on a3. This knight and the pawn are keeping the king out of key squares in this position. But it needs something else. It needs spice, doesn't it? But first, okay, c3 is also a target though. So knight e4. How can that pawn actually be defended? It's given up here by Nigel. An exchange of prisoners again. c3 for the h3 pawn. So rook takes c2, rook takes h3 again. White's only a pawn up though. Can Nigel draw this position? We see rook c7 check. It's quite dangerous because if king e6, there's knight g5 check, forking king and rook. So unfortunately for Nigel, there's a rook on the 7th now, emerged after all this. Very dangerous. Rook a7, and is a6 needing to be protected? Yes, bishop c4. But now, Magnus is a pawn up still, g5. These look like a dangerous couple of pawns to use. Rook h4, and now we see it tactically, knight d6 attacking c4. And it looks really quite bad now for black. After bishop e6, g6, this pawn is really quite dangerous. Rook g4, g7. Can black hold this? The bishop is also eyeing g8, so there's no tactic at the moment to win a rook with g8. a5, just trying to exchange off a5 for g7. But Magnus plays king f3. Rook g1. Now very powerful knight maneuver in this position. Knight B7 check. After king E8, knight C5. This is really troublesome now. Hitting that bishop. Bishop F7. And it looks as though E6 might be tempting. But actually that's not the intention. The intention now is knight E4, centralizing again, and threatening knight D6 check, winning the bishop. But also it seems G7 is on, and wouldn't that protect the bishop, you ask? Well, okay, that is taken. So actually we're equal on pawns now. But after knight D6 check, it's clear that the king, if it goes to E7, now there's knight F5 check, forking rook and king. Magnus can actually force this scenario. If the king moves obviously to D8, then F7 is to be taken. So the king goes to F8, but now check. It's a killer check. Although you might think, hold on a sec, king and rook are on the same diagonal for bishop D5. Well, after king E7, Magnus is aware of that. He plays check, which promises to win the rook. So if king E6, knight takes G7 clearly, but king D7, and now of course taking the rook would result maybe in bishop D5, and black is okay again. No, Magnus plays though in this position just rook A7 check, so he can now freely take the rook, and here Nigel resigned. So it turned out, it seems, if we casually observe the game, that maybe G5 was a bit dodgy in inverted commas, but it had positional motivation. But let's check again under engine inspection this game. So was White actually slightly better throughout, or did he have actual problems from an engine point of view? Technical perspective here. Bishop D3 was given as a good move. Now we see D4, and the move E4, is that suspect? Queen C2, E takes D4. The move E4 is okay as well, apparently, as an option. We give the engine more time here, we'll come up with E4 as a move. Okay. So, still, White had a small advantage here, technically. Now G4 looks a bit dodgy from an engine point of view, preferring Rook C1 or E5. After G4 it looks as though Black is closing in on equality. Bishop G6, Knight D2. Now this next move, F6, okay, it seems reasonable actually, as a reasonable move, idea. It seems like a very powerful move. So far so good. Black's almost getting an advantage, tiny advantage, microscopic, but at least equal. So Rook C1, we saw King H8. Useful prophylaxis move, Knight C4, and the bishop goes to C7. So Black's kind of, by exchanging the dark square weaknesses, clearly these dark square weaknesses look ripe for exploitation, but F4 covers E5, albeit creating a vacuum here. It looks as though Black's at least equal Queen F3. We saw Queen E7. Now Rook CE1 was chosen, not Rook FE1. In fact, the engine doesn't mind Rook FE1 here. But okay, after Bishop F7, Knight D2, was this kind of a trap in a wider, deeper sense that it could have been bypassed? This next move is not mentioned at the moment by the engine. G5 may be a slight compromise of position, or is it? It seems something has occurred in evaluation for Bishop E5 to be a tiny bit better for White after Bishop B5. Of course, if F5 or FG, then Black's going to be miles better, I expect, on the valuation. Much better there, much better on FG. But unfortunately, you know, with precision, white can take all the advantages away from g5 without giving back any advantages either. So bishop b5 is the move here, which is really giving white something now. Now a6, is that the most accurate? In this position, white is also weakening d4, that d4 pawn indirectly in this scenario, because it's supported by that knight that's about to be eliminated. So the move bishop e6 or bishop g8, would this result in the loss of a pawn? White's better, but it's not resulting in the loss of a pawn. So unfortunately this a6 looks like an unfortunate blunder. I don't know, Magnus hypnotises British grandmasters like none, and short to win pawns at key moments, it seems. So after bishop takes c6, f takes g5, queen f6, white's on the verge of winning a pawn here, or worse, because what is happening here, if queen takes f6, which wasn't played, then c6 looks like a major liability now. If it's pushed to lose a6, is that a problem? Or is there something else? Maybe taking on a6 isn't actually the problem here, because black seems to have pawn mobility. So if we take on a6, rook b8, and black seems to have, you know, good play. In fact, almost equality again. If white has to sacrifice to get a good position, well, that's interesting. That breaks up the pawns and gets a pin. Seems quite good. So white's okay, but okay, so maybe this is an okay continuation, but white doesn't have to take on a6 here. So say rook e f1, just piling up the pressure. Rook 6 to f5, forking actually two pawns, double attack. Taking here, and again, is this better than the game though? Because there seems to be some pawn mobility, or are the pawns not actually that dangerous? This rook and pawn ending possibly is better than the game continuation. It's less than half pawn advantage. So in the game continuation, Nigel lost the pawn, centre pawn, just by playing king g8. And so queen takes d4. Whoops, seems to have deleted the whole score sheet there, pardon me. Maybe the score sheet's still around. So queen takes d4. It's played, and now white's advantage has become clearer. It looks as though, unless black can use that b file, where is the compensation? That b file has the b2 pawn as a sitting target. Queen f6 is played, which might not be the most accurate. Apparently queen c3 is more accurate. So after queen f6, it seems as though almost half a pawn advantage is blown with queen f6. But maybe too keen to exchange off queens here, Magnus at the time. Because rook b8 does promise as though black's got an active game, and the advantage is less than half a pawn again. But g5 is a liability, so it's attacked. Exchange of b2 for g5. So bishop a2, maybe that's maybe bishop g6 is worth considering, just holding on to h7. Again, white seems to have an advantage here, just over half a pawn anyway. But with bishop a2, it looks as though that's a second pawn sacrifice, basically, of h7. So banking on maybe the c pawn being dangerous, or rook b3 being dangerous, or both, the c pawn and rook b3 being available. But Magnus grabs that second pawn and plays knight g5, and then arrests this c pawn. The criminal, as Dimizovich might say, has to be kept under lock and key. Rook b3, tying down the knight for a moment and attacking a3. So black's only going to be a pawn down. Now after this move, this looks like a bit of a blunder actually from an engine point of view. So Rook takes A3 here, Knight F3, C3. Again, it's not too hot for black once these pawns perhaps start moving. It looks as though this could be trouble in any case if the king comes to F4. White's advantage seems to be on the way to increasing. Tactical bishop D5. Even in this position, it seems as though this is dangerous for black. So in the game we saw C3, which engine doesn't like clearly. E5, again, it seems an inaccuracy for H4, so there's some subtleties going on. But E5 seems to have, you know, a lot of logic behind it, just to get the knight back to try and win this pawn. So why would you think in this position H4? Why would that be much stronger? Well, it's away from the glare of the rook. And if black takes on A3, H5, is it the H pawn which actually can play a critical role here? It was worth preserving. Give black the C pawn, let black have that for the H pawn. It's supported by the G pawn. Okay, so we have this kind of scenario where that would be very dangerous for black. So maybe Magnus let Nigel slightly off the hook by letting him play this C2 idea. Now, if the pawn is moved here, okay, then there's a tactical resource, Rook H3. So this pawn is immune now because of check. And this isn't too hot for white now. If Knight G5, okay, it starts to get a bit dangerous with this C pawn. Okay, maybe a draw there. So, okay. So we see in this position, though, that after Knight E4, black maybe blunder to play C2 here. King E6, Bishop C4. King E6 might be a better move, apparently. If takes, king takes E5. Okay. So we see C2, Rook takes C2, Rook takes H3, and white is in the driving seat here. I think mainly the powerful Rook on the 7th gives white a big edge now, which the engine recognises. So Rook A7, Bishop C4, and now it's becoming easier, just using that G pawn. Using the G pawn again and again, and now there's a tactical unfortunateness created in black's position up to Knight E4. Was that actually making things worse? On Bishop D5 check, isn't there an option just of King F4? Whoops. I think King F4 would be okay for white as well. But okay. So we saw Bishop F7, so Knight E4 threatening to win a piece with Knight D6 check. Now the other option here, okay, Bishop D5, King F4, it's still better for white apparently. So this is just unfortunate now. This ending is okay. Black's losing that rook. An impressive game. Magnus scalping basically Nigel, who's at the time of this game, Nigel short was more than 100 Fine points higher. So 2-5-8-1 for Magnus, and Nigel was 2-6-8-7. It was their first long game encounter, I think. Serious time control. Hope you got something out of it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.